for Europe. I am Liam, joined here by Russian Sam.
Hello, hello.
And today we have a very special guest, one of our best and oldest friends.
And our chief Catholic correspondent.
Yes, chief Catholic correspondent, our man coming to us from the papal conclave. We have James at Gomanismed. How are you doing?
Good. Salve, salve. It's good to be back. It's good to be out of the robes for once.
Is this what, your third, fourth episode here?
I think something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you have to be you are thinking now officially the reigning Gladio champ. And yet again, you're going to be discussing a really interesting aspect of Catholic Church history. This is something that comes up again and again on this podcast. I think just because for the simple reason that the Catholic Church is so old and so shadowy with such, so many plans measured in centuries that there are so many stories of the Catholic Church that just transcend the centuries. You can talk about the Catholics in 17th century Japan, you can talk about the Catholics in 7th century France, or you can talk about the Catholics in 1930s Spain. Because for this episode, we are going back to something we've touched on a few times, especially with one of our Gladio side projects. That being the Spanish Civil War and the many tensions in Spanish society leading up to it. This is something that, you've been studying for a while, James. Mm-hmm. Just to start us off, would you mind sharing in brief a little bit about how you first came to the Spanish Civil War as a topic? And in particular, the whole religious arena?
Yeah, absolutely. So my great-grandfather was a member of the International Brigades. He was a Communist Party member, fought, I believe, was wounded in action, and then, did return home in time to eventually set in the motions that made me exist. So, that was sort of when I first learned this when I was a kid, this was something that he never really talked about, at least with my grandfather. My mom found it while just doing, family research sometime in the mid 2000s and, came up to her dad and was like, "Dad, did you know that, Grampy was in Spain and got shot in the arm?" And he was like, "Oh, I guess that explains that bullet scar he never talked about." So that that gives you an idea of sort of how much my family just kind of doesn't really talk. But, so after that, I was like, well, I didn't even know that there was a war in Spain, And so, over the years, it's, something that I've, grown more and more interested in, especially, because it's such a fascinating topic. And no matter what you're coming to the table with, you can find almost certainly something in this period that you can resonate with and sort of help you understand not only Europe and the world of the 1930s, but Europe and the world today, and of the legacy of trying to deal with this extremely difficult period in history.
Yeah, no, and I think also what's interesting with the Catholic element here is that you're seeing this incredibly ancient institution adapting to changes in modernity where things are changing very, very fast. And the church often responds in ways that I think are pretty shockingly brutal, but they're certainly not the only ones meting out brutality in this context. And I think it's cool that we're doing this one now because the Catholic Church is probably more relevant to the lives of our listeners, or at least the interests of our listeners, than it usually is. Obviously, as we mentioned, there is a papal conclave going on as we are recording this. The last Pope, Francis, has passed away. There is now a lot of talk about who the next Pope will be, and also what kind of orientation, both theologically and politically, the Catholic Church is going to have moving forward. Pope Francis has this reputation of much more of a progressive Catholic than many other bishops and cardinals. I think a lot of American Catholics who have a more conservative bent really resent him for this reason. And that's why the other kind of funny element here is that there's been this bizarre and frankly very embarrassing resurgence of right-wing Catholicism, many times by people who were not raised Catholic, including, the current vice president. You're seeing this strange embrace, mostly online, not entirely online, of Catholic political principles that were actually put into practice into this period, into the 19th and early 20th century. And I think it's in this period, we see what a lot of those Catholic principles looked like in practice, and the ways that many people, often very desperate, very poor people from the most deprived rungs of Spanish society, put their lives on the line trying to fight these principles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when you talk about sort of harkening back to the past, that's really what it was, because certainly most of these people, even if they were born Catholic, were born, after the Second Vatican Council, certainly after the Second World War. And what we see in Spain is sort of the last gasp of a truly anti-liberal. And I mean that in the sense of a classical liberalism, in terms of representative democracy. The last gasp of it before the final rapprochement, I would say, with liberal democracy, especially in Europe, following the end of the Second World War and the horrors of Nazi Germany.
And I think that... And I think a better way to describe it, rather than just being anti-liberal, we're seeing one of the last pre-revolutionary institutions, one of the last institutions from the 17th century, before the 18th century Atlantic revolutions, desperately attempting to cling on to power and ultimately succeeding in the short term.
Exactly.
All right, so I guess there's so much we can get into here, because this is a huge topic, and this is going to be a really cool one. Let's just start by explaining what the Catholic Church in Spain looked like in the 19th and early 20th century and how it got there.
Yeah, so I mean, it's always going to be a struggle to really neatly define the Catholic Church, just because in Spain, especially, it's just been so multifarious. For example, in the 16th century, among the church ranks, you found both people who supported the heavy-handed repression of indigenous peoples in the Americas under the newly minted Spanish authority, people like Juan de Sepulveda, as well as those who viewed the indigenous as deserving of rights, just like any other people, like Bartolomeo de las Casas and Francisco de Vitoria. But despite the presence of these differences, the church was always heavily intertwined with the forces of the old order. The church really served as the ultimate legitimizing device for the Spanish monarchy, and justification for the order was imposed by the nobles as the Spanish masses toiled under conditions that changed little through the centuries.
Right, and I think that's really important to get into here, is that the Industrial Revolution as we know it had never really taken hold in Spain by the 1930s, and that means that in a lot of ways, the social and economic life of Spain at the start of the 20th century was much closer to Russia and Poland and Eastern Europe than it was to anywhere else in Western Europe, except maybe Portugal and Ireland.
Yeah, and just because the church had such a wide-spanning influence over society, which was often very nefarious. Priests were constantly being lampooned as corrupt, the monks were always viewed as these parasitic gluttons, and nuns were these sort of lecherous whores. And even really faithful Catholics were often disillusioned by the representatives of God on earth.
Right. No, and we mentioned how in our previous episode on communes, there was this argument in favor of separation of church and state, not from a secular perspective, but from a religious perspective. Not the fear that the church would corrupt the state, but that the state would corrupt the church. This was a really widespread concern among both regular people on the ground, everyday farmers, and educated intellectuals in 18th and 19th century Spain. There was in particular a lot of distrust of the Jesuit order, which had held a lot of influence in both Spain and Portugal, in the governments of those countries since the order was founded in the 16th century.
Yeah. So let's just talk a little bit more about the church, because again, this isn't just, the place where your abuelita goes on the weekends to ask God for forgiveness. This was, a major pillar of society. They controlled large quantities of land, and they were deriving huge profits, both from rent they charged from it, as well as their parishioners in more regular ways you'd expect from the church. They also had a monopoly on education throughout the country. And really, this was the true state religion. They were extremely heavy-handed. It took a very long time for the idea of separation of church and state to actually come to Spain. And when it actually does, it sort of sparks the Spanish Civil War, as we're going to talk about in a little bit. So the church was really the target of many reform-minded people across the centuries. They really viewed it as an impediment to the construction of a liberal and later a post-liberal order. The American and French revolutions had gotten liberal-minded Spaniards interested in ideas about separation of church and state from the 18th century, but it would take a while for these ideas to actually come to fruition.
Yeah, and I think one thing we should mention is that Spain was immediately very interested in the French Revolution. In addition to the obvious geographic proximity, both Spain and France in the late 18th century were ruled by the House of Bourbon. And, we all know what happened to the House of Bourbon in France. In Spain, they managed to hang on up until the present, I believe. And so you begin to see this process where political and ideological developments in France very quickly pass over the Pyrenees and begin influencing Spain.
Yeah. And I mean, something else also crosses over the Pyrenees, namely Napoleon, because in 1808, he invaded Spain. This is what we here in the Anglo world called the Peninsular War. In Spain, it's just the War of Independence. And Napoleon, he had really big plans for Spanish society. He wanted to reform it along French lines, and that included dealing with the church. The monasteries in the French zone were stripped of their land and privileges, just as had happened to the church in France. Many of the monks were disrobed and sort of forced into a secular lifestyle. And there was a lot of overlap between the conduct of the church in Ancien Regime France and in Spain. But Spain, from this point going forwards, had this very unique configuration within its church, because unlike most other national Catholic churches, the Spanish church was institutionally a very active participant in conflicts from this point going forward. So during this Peninsular War, a crusade was declared against the invading French forces, and Spanish priests and monks became active belligerent. Every single province of Spain had at least one military formation that was led by a monk or a priest, and they were basically on the anti-liberation theology grind, is the way I'd put it. But
exactly. It was, it's the Catholic Church was directly intervening in reactionary violence against attempts to spread 18th century Enlightenment values across Europe. Because, you can debate all day long about to what extent Napoleon represented the values of the French Revolution, or if he represented the defeat of those values. But to peoples outside of France, to aristocrats and to the clergy, Napoleon was absolutely seen as this kind of terrifying, modernizing force that they violently resisted. And I think it's no coincidence that Spain is one of the only places where reactionary forces very successfully dealt with the invading French army. This is how we get the word guerrilla. These militia bands of anti-French rebels that were often led by monks in Spain. So French influence over the peninsula would be quite short-lived in the Napoleonic period. It would give us some cool paintings by Goya, but it would also give us a lot of interesting ideological transformations, however, that would contribute to the next 150 years or so of Spanish politics.
Yeah, so in the Peninsular War, as I said already, the priesthood learned how to take up arms, and they would do this several times in the 19th century, 3 times during the Carlist Wars. Like, Spain had 3 separate Carlist Wars, as James is going to tell us about in a little bit.
Just a little interrupt here. This is just to show how medieval Spain was in this period. The Carlist Wars were dynastic uprisings by a monarchical claimant, like real Crusader king stuff that went on deep until the 20th century.
Yeah, and speaking of Crusader kings, like, the church was declaring crusades left and right during these wars, and of course, the Spanish Civil War also became a crusade to the Spanish church, which is something that really should be kept in mind when the subject of Republican atrocities against the church is brought up, because there was a pretty substantial foundation for this aside from the general anti-clericalism. Returning back to the Peninsular War, the French invasion proved very unpopular in the country, because even though a lot of people within Spain would have sympathized with the ideals of the French Revolution, as it turns out, invading a country isn't a way to establish a lot of goodwill. So although the liberals in Spain, they wanted reform, they by and large were not supporters of the Napoleonic incursion, and instead they were sort of able to leverage their position to champion reform through the Spanish government in exile. And because of liberal influence, the Cadiz Constitution of 1812 included numerous reforms, including universal male suffrage, I think this probably would have been like the first constitution to guarantee that outside of France.
Yeah.
And liberal clerical reformers were very strongly represented in this process. Of the 300 deputies in the first parliament, there were some 90 clergymen. This isn't to say that although there were some serious reforms on the table, the separation of church and state was not one of them. The Cadiz Constitution read that, quote, "The religion of the Spanish nation is and will be perpetually the Apostolic Roman Catholic Church, the only true faith. The nation protects it through wise and just laws and prohibits the exercise of any other."
Right. And I think that this kind of points to this trend that we're going to see, especially after the French Revolution and the rise of secularism in France, which is that it left Spain as arguably the most Catholic nation on earth, certainly the country in which the Catholic Church had the most direct control over government and society.
But despite the fact that the liberal clergy were so overrepresented in this first attempt at a liberal government, it should be noted that these people were in the minority. An overwhelming majority of the Spanish clergy at the time were strongly anti-liberal. Stanley Payne describes this majoritarian position as follows, quote, "Since the 1790s, many Catholic spokesmen had insisted ever more loudly that the integrity of the faith and of Spanish culture itself could be defended only by the wholesale rejection of all the impious modern doctrines of pseudo-enlightenment that exalted human reason and rejected God. As the disasters of war, plague, and economic decline were followed by full-scale invasion, prophetic voices called on Spaniards to repent, unite, and return to the ways of their fathers. The conservative majority, weakly represented at Cadiz, could accept constitutional liberalism only insofar as it could be made fully compatible with traditional ecclesiastical structure and practice, a compromise that was not easily achieved. Additionally to these conservatives, there was also an ultra-right absolutist monarchist wing, which hoped to see a retrenchment of absolute monarchy, which would be reinforced by the church. This was a small but influential minority, and there would sort of be a tug of war between the reformers and the Catholic conservatives and traditionalists for a very long time to come. Sometimes the reformers would gain the upper hand, but other times the conservatives. And this struggle was sort of a manifestation of the broader disputes seen across Europe in the post-Napoleonic era. The difference being that the church in Spain was starting from a much stronger position than most of the other churches, and it would remain in the running for much longer. They were prepared to do much more than bare their teeth to defend their interests, as we're about to learn. But try as these reactionary forces might, it really wasn't that easy to put the toothpaste back in the tube. So even after Napoleon's forces were successfully beaten back, the church found itself in a weakened position. The monastic orders continued to bleed people, and emergent reading public was creating a space for anti-clerical newspapers to circulate, and morals were beginning to laxen, especially among the former peasants who were gradually making their way into the cities. Because of this environment, there were a lot of attempts at beating back the modern world, and the first of these would happen with the return of Fernando VII from exile. He would be the author of the first major reaction when he returned from exile in 1814, and he made temporary headway in retrenching the church's authority and silencing reformist voices within the church. Many of the church reformers were basically forced to go into exile, and it was not a pleasant time at all for people who weren't part of the conservative wing. Fernando VII, he was not so much retrenching the church on its own terms, but rather he viewed it as a useful tool to accomplish his other political goals, that being, of course, cementing his own absolutist power. And the reactionaries within the church were happy to assist it so long as it strengthened their position.
Right. No, and this involves rolling back most of the achievements of the previous 1812 Constitution.
Yeah. And so after a number of years of this, some very intrepid military officers got tired of this. And so in 1820, they would launch the first of many pronunciamentos in the 19th century. The pronunciamentos were basically, when a group of officers in Spain would decide that the royal government was overstepping its bounds.
Yeah, no, I think in other words, juntas were so common in Spain, they had two different words for them.
Yeah, so this 1820 pronunciamento, it began disbanding and regulating the convents once again, which caused some priests and monks to once again take up arms. The reaction once more gained the upper hand after 1823 when Fernando VII returned to power, and it would continue until Fernando's death in 1833.
Yeah, and I think we also have to put this into the context of the 1820s when, now, about a decade after the Napoleonic Wars, it was a bit safer to revisit these Enlightenment values that were associated with the defeated French Revolution. This is kind of the same context in which we see the Working Men's Party in New York that we discussed in episode 104, in the the labor disputes in Britain around this time. So it's interesting that even though Spain was very peripheral economically in many ways to the Western economy at this time, these broader regional trends in economics and ideology still often have some Spanish knockdown effects. This is now a great time to get into the spread of mass anti-clericalism in Spain, which really takes off after this Cadiz mutiny in the decade after this. For various reasons, in the 1830s, especially after the death of Fernando VII, many people in Spain, not educated liberals, but everyday workers and peasants, came to be deeply, deeply dissatisfied with the Catholic Church. This mass anti-clericalism. James, anything you can share about 19th century anti-clericalism before we get into it in detail?
Sure. Like in the end of the 18th century in France, a lot of this wasn't necessarily so much an expression of sort of just anti-religious sentiment in general. Like in France, there were those who did oppose it on the grounds of religion rather than sort of the institutional and structural elements of the church. But like in pre-revolutionary France, you have this religious institution which not only controls, your access to the sacraments, which are tied to your ability to go to heaven or hell in the hereafter. You also have to pay rent to this institution. This institution is holding up aspects of the government, which, especially if you're politically minded, you might not be too happy with. So there's, in addition to the spiritual frustrations, especially with things like, corrupt priests and bishops, which exist in every society, the economic and political aspects of the church in Spain were felt very acutely compared to some other places across the continent where liberalism in whatever modified forms in the post-Napoleonic world had managed to secure a stronger bargaining position against the church where it existed.
And things really kind of began to boil over again after the death of Fernando VII in the 1830s. And I think the biggest part of it is because when Fernando VII died, there was this dynastic dispute leading to the rise of those Carlist rebels we mentioned earlier. Carlism is really interesting. It's arguably has survived until the present, amazingly. It's one of the strangest and most enduring political movements in, the past 150 years in Europe. But one interesting element of Carlism is that it was always strongest in the Basque-speaking regions of Spain in the north, which actually at this time in the 19th and early 20th centuries were actually some of the most economically developed parts of Spain. But so looking with the emergence of this Carlist uprising in 1833 led to a lot of paranoia in all sectors of Spanish society, and there was widespread distrust of the Catholic Church, particularly the Jesuit order, for supporting these Carlist rebels against the Spanish government. Then that same year that the Carlist uprising happened, there was a cholera outbreak, and several months into this outbreak in 1834, a panic began to spread that the disease was caused by priests poisoning the wells. And, I gotta say, the fact that there was this well poisoning plague panic kind of goes to show how medieval Spain still was in the 1830s. Yes. And, but the reaction to this rumor was pretty horrific, as, reactions to accusations of well poisoning tend to be. Because a young boy was seen dropping some dirt into a well, probably just a kid being a dumb kid. But this was seen as proof that he was doing the handiwork of the priests. So this little child was grabbed by the mob and stabbed to death in the street. This mob then, clearly not satisfied, rampaged across Madrid, killing dozens of monks and nuns, in particular Jesuits. Although this angle did not circulate until a few decades after, only in retrospect, it was later widely believed that not only was it true that the Jesuits had poisoned these wells, but that they had done so in tandem with the Freemasons. And I'm bringing this up only because anti-Masonry is going to be a pretty strange recurring element in the later 19th century up until the Spanish Civil War in Spain.
Yeah, well, the reason being, of course, that the liberals were extremely involved with Freemasonic lounges in Spain in like the 1810s and 1820s. So the first Fernandine reaction was also like very heavily anti-Freemason. This was just something that was in the air, I guess. But yeah, it was
I believe you mean lodges, not lounges. But it is fun to imagine the Freemasons, playing some like smooth jazz in their smoking jackets.
And something that we can keep in mind about early 19th century Spanish language Freemasonry is one, there is, this classic difference within the Freemasonry movement between continental Freemasonry and the British Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And one of the most important differences is that in the continental system, which is the one found pretty much in all of Europe, except for Britain, and crucially in Latin America as well, is that there is no rule against talking about politics within the lodge.
Oh.
And so what this meant, and this remains true to this day in terms of the splits, and so what you see is, especially in Spanish America, of these revolutionaries, Simon Bolivar, many of his contemporaries were all Masons, or at least connected to Freemasonry. And this, sort of the legacy of continental Freemasonry in Spanish-speaking Americas continues to the point, as well as obviously, especially right-wing conspiracy theories revolving around it. We see it with a lot of these conspiracies by right-wing forces in Chile about Salvador Allende, who was...
so as late as the 70s, they were doing anti-Masonry down there.
Exactly. And it's not exclusively tied to the right wing. If any of us remember the last Brazilian presidential election, there were some PT Telegram channels which were circulating
the
a
party of the
photograph
Trabajadores, the left-wing party.
Yes. Were circulating a photograph of then President Jair Bolsonaro with the Masonic aprons standing at some sort of Masonic lodge in order to, cast aspersions that he was part of some grand Masonic conspiracy to sell out Brazil to the right wing in this instance.
Yeah. And that's the funny thing. You're right. And you see this in this Spanish context as well. There's distrust of Freemasonry by both the left and the right. And that I think it just speaks to the kind of paranoia of Spanish society, because you have this society that's changing quite fast in certain ideological ways, but there are a lot of very old social institutions that survive, most notably the Catholic Church. And I think that tends to be a combination that leads to a lot of civil unrest. When you have these institutions, whether the Masons or the church, that are kind of, scrambling for relevancy in a world that's rapidly changing, it's easy to believe that they might be up to something. And oftentimes, let's be honest, they are. And, so going back to the 1830s, there's another set of anti-clerical riots the next year in 1835. One of them in Barcelona was interestingly caused by a sports riot by a bunch of guys bored by an uninteresting bullfight who decided to take to the streets, just burning and looting convents. This was a pretty common thing in the 1830s, and this was, over a century before the Spanish Civil War. There's already this, frankly, vibrant tradition of anti-clerical violence among everyday Spanish commoners. This, of course, horrified reactionaries at the time, but many respectable liberals turned a blind eye to this because they themselves had these, strongly anti-clerical sentiments, because it was widely believed that the entrenched influence of the Catholic Church was holding Spain back.
A way to think about that, especially when we're thinking about monasteries, is sort of to differentiate it between other countries which had, for example, England under Henry VIII famously dissolved the monasteries, which was, in a sense, a form of land reform in England. It broke up these massive, essentially private landowners with extreme, not only financial capital, but political capital as well, and broke it up in order to facilitate, an economic modernization of the country. And Spain never really had that. It had neither the great French revolutionary fervor and, political movements which allowed France to sort of clamp down on the power of the church. It is sort of this politically, when you call it medieval, it's it's almost closer to just the last gasp of that very early modern pre-revolutionary European order, trying and oftentimes failing to adapt successfully to changes in the global market, global political ideas. It is, and these problems only get worse over time until they eventually reach perhaps their greatest breaking point in the 1930s.
Yeah. And so we mentioned earlier that this initial anti-clericalism was not necessarily anti-religious or even anti-Catholic. It was this dissatisfaction with the opulence of the Catholic Church and their economic and political influence over society. This begins to change in the later 19th century as socialist ideas from France and Germany and Russia begin circulating across Spain, starting with the more developed areas like Catalonia and the Basque Country, where there were these industrial workers, these organized miners and dock workers and factory workers more receptive to these kinds of new ideas. Initially, the most popular radical thinker in Spain was the anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, who was the great rival of Karl Marx. Anarchist literature demanding the overthrow of both economic and religious hierarchies begins circulating from the cities into the countryside. You start seeing these traveling young radicals, just like the Russian Narodniks, who would read out socialist pamphlets to the illiterate peasants of the interior, especially the dry regions of Extremadura and Andalusia. One thing that's also happening this time is that even though these areas are still quite feudal, often dominated by these local landlords called caciques, you begin seeing this kind of financialization as these poor farmers are increasingly indebted to various banks from the city. If you're living in this kind of world where a traditional agrarian subsistence lifestyle is no longer tenable, rejecting all authority, going back to just you and your plow, that's going to make a lot of sense. And I think this explains why this kind of agrarian anarchism is so popular in Spain, whereas it usually was not elsewhere in Western Europe. Spain was so rural that rural socialist ideologies made the most sense to the population.
Events would just continue developing until finally in 1873, the young King Amadeo decided that he would abdicate the throne, which led to the creation of the First Spanish Republic. Radicals and liberals initially both supported the new government, but in a preview of what was to come in the 1930s, the relations between these two factions almost immediately soured. And sensing an opportunity to, sow chaos or spread liberation, depending on your perspective, anarchist rebels took up arms against the liberal Republicans, and they seized many small towns in the countryside, which on several occasions resulted in the killing of government workers and priests. In the town of Alcoy, for example, the rebel working men used new chemicals to burn factories and estate buildings, which gave it the name the Petroleum Revolution.
Frederick Engels wrote at the time that all the horror stories carried out by the bourgeois papers about factories senselessly burnt down, numerous gendarmes shot down, and of course people having petrol poured on them and set on fire are pure inventions. The victorious workers always treat their defeated adversaries far too generously, and so the latter accuse them of all the misdeeds which they themselves never fail to perpetrate when they are victorious. So although the people of Alcoy and these rebels more broadly would succeed at taking a lot of small towns, this victory would be short-lived as they were unable to defend their gains from the Spanish military. Engels pointed out that the militia refused to organize themselves into a real army due to their anarchist principles. But he also points out that these guys had no problem wielding authority in other arbitrary ways. Ultimately, infighting within the anarchist movement allowed the government to march into the rebel towns without much organized resistance. And Engels insists that their failure shows fundamental problems with Bakunin's ideology.
Yeah, but the Spanish establishment was really properly spooked by all these events. So shortly after the defeat of the anarchists in 1874, there was a new pronunciamiento, which overthrew the republic and brought back the monarchy, viewing this Republican experiment as being far too chaotic. The new pronunciamiento regime began to slowly move towards economic development, but almost all of the investment was in the Basque and Catalan port cities. So gestures were made towards constitutional monarchy, but whatever Republican institutions existed were dominated by by the local agrarian elites called the caciques, which was actually a name taken from the indigenous chiefs of the Caribbean. And so this period of Spanish history is dominated by what's called caciquismo, where basically there were elections, but there was a lot of corruption in these elections. And basically it was a matter of one party handing over rule to the other party every 4 or 5 years whenever elections were, without much protest. So it was very unsatisfactory for most people. There would be periodic rebellions against it, both from anarchists as well as other nascent socialist movements found within Spain.
Yeah, so in Spain, the specific name for the system of swapping power back and forth was literally called turnismo, or turnism. So it was basically the conservative and the liberal parties each would take their turn at governing, which may, in some people's eyes, mean that there was an increase in stability. But what it certainly did not mean was that there was an increase in confidence in the electoral process. If effectively, it was pretty clear that your vote really didn't mean that much if the two parties were just going to keep swapping back and forth regardless.
Yeah. And I mean, this was in a context where they didn't have the secret ballot. So if you wanted to vote, you had to actually publicly go to the polling place of the party you were voting for, which naturally sort of tamped down on what people were voting for and gave these caciques a lot of power over what the local peasants would have been supporting.
Yeah. And we have to keep in mind that while all of this is happening, Spain is still managing to hold on to this worldwide empire. It's a lot weaker than it had been before Napoleon, when they still held on to almost all of the Americas. But they still had Cuba, the Philippines, some small possessions in Africa, including Morocco. But in the late 19th century, this is also starting to crumble. You see 3 different Cuban uprisings in the 19th century. That's also kind of a common theme. Lots of triple uprisings in Spanish history. And the third of these uprisings in Cuba gave the United States its pretext to invade the entire Spanish colonial empire in 1898. The speed of the American victory in the Spanish-American War shocked the entire world, but nobody was more surprised than the Spaniards themselves. Their colonies of Cuba and the Philippines had been Spanish for so long that control of these territories was central to the entire Spanish identity. Cuba was also really well integrated into Spanish society and the Spanish economy. It was somewhat developed. I think Havana was more developed than most of Spain itself at this time. So this was a huge economic and ideological loss. Intellectuals calling themselves the Children of 98 blamed Spain's failure on its own backwardness, including the lack of democracy, the survival of feudal agrarian institutions, and of course, the dominance of the Catholic Church. Meanwhile, Spanish reactionaries doubled down on their control of the surviving small colonies, including a sliver of northern Morocco called the Rif. We've discussed the Rif in passing, but just like the Carlists and the Cubans, Berber tribesmen in this part of Morocco would lead 3 different uprisings against the Spanish Empire, with pretty big implications on the development of internal Spanish politics. And I think that as a result of this, we're seeing even more of this paranoia we've been describing throughout the episode. Spanish reactionaries believe that so much of their own society is out to get them. And now that they've lost their colonies, the whole Spanish idea is under threat. Because the idea of Spain as this enlightened Catholic power spreading, Catholicism to the lesser peoples of the world, to the less civilized peoples, this was so important to the reactionary Spanish worldview. And it's a worldview that after the Spanish-American War seems a lot less tenable and is going to need to be defended by a lot more brutal violence.
Yeah, so the second of these 3 rebellions in the Rif happened in 1909, and this forced the Spanish to draft large numbers of men in Barcelona in particular. So the man leading the draft charge was named Marqués Claudio de Comillas, and he was also known for his close ties to the Catholic Church. As the draftees rioted, they attacked not only army offices, but also the monasteries and the churches. The same kind of anti-clericalism that we've seen in the past century in Spain was once again rearing its head. The riots and arson killed over 100 civilians, many of them being monks and nuns as well as hundreds more who were injured. Both sides blamed the Freemasons for instigating the violence. This is called La Semana Trágica, the tragic week, and it would have a very strong... Yeah,
Yeah, no, definitely. And then, so kind of moving forward to the next couple decades in Spain, Spain would actually benefit enormously from the First World War because they were one of the few neutral powers in Europe, meaning they could trade freely with both sides. Again, you see lots of wealth coming into Spain, but mostly concentrated in the eastern part of the country where there's the most industry. You also begin to see increased organizing of radical urban workers that really starts to explode in 1917 when the Soviet Revolution inspires working men's movements just really globally, all over the planet, from, Spain and America in the West to Indonesia and China and the Philippines in the East.
And also, Spain was a very particular example because the Spanish government had enough good sense to stay out of World War I. And in fact, Spain was undergoing sort of a major economic boom during this period because their means of production were untouched and they were able to sell goods to everyone else. But because when the war ended and suddenly the other capitalist powers were able to switch from making munitions to making everything else, suddenly there was this massive economic depression that hit Spain because they were overproducing compared to what the market was actually demanding. And of course, this caused mass layoffs. And once again, there was wide-scale civil unrest within the country until finally, following the footsteps of Mussolini, there was a man named Primo de Rivera who sort of stepped in as the first iteration of Spanish fascism, who would lead the country for some years until finally the Spanish people got tired of his shit and kicked him out.
So through most of the 1920s, Spain was dominated by this guy who was called at the time the Spanish Mussolini. And even though he was, this was before the kind of, Spain's later, fascist period under Franco. This is a whole entirely different figure. However, in 1931, this government would be overthrown largely due to the efforts of the more radical wings of the opposition movement. And this led to, in 1931, the Second Spanish Republic. This is we're really kind of moving into the meat of this episode right now. James, any thoughts more broadly on who made up the Second Republic, what their goals were, and why they terrified the Catholic Church so much?
So the Second Republic was initially broadly what we could consider an alliance between the liberals and the left-wing forces. Later, we'll have sort of the right-wing reaction within the framework of the Republican democracy. But at the time, so really there were, of course, the liberals made up a good majority of those participating in the Second Republic. And so really what they wanted to do was to modernize the country, and particularly not necessarily to go to war with the church by any means, but certainly to start demanding concessions from the church. And one of these was a real separation of church and state.
Yes, no, you begin to see liberal factions within this movement pushing for the first true public schools in Spanish history that were explicitly secular based on the French model. It was no longer the case that every person in Spain had to go to a Catholic school if they were going to go to school at all.
Exactly. Yeah. Because frankly, the educational situation in Spain at the time was abysmal, certainly by the standards of what we can think of as the Western European countries, right? There was large amounts of illiteracy, many people who simply just had what we would not consider an adequate adult education. And so the hope was that not only would the government be able to increase literacy and general educational knowledge throughout the country, but crucially, and we'll talk about this a bit more later, having control over the education system meant that the Catholic Church in Spain had also a clear and oftentimes unsupervised, really, unchecked power to spread what we can think of as political ideologies which are hostile to classical liberalism, sort of these reactionary, if not outright legitimist, then certainly hostile to the new liberal order that they were trying to build, which again, you have to keep in mind, this is the 1930s. This isn't something that the government is dealing with in the 1870s or 1880s. By this point, obviously, France has well passed the age of the church-run schools and the ability of the church to teach children to be inherently hostile to not only Republican governments, but the ideas of Republicanism and liberalism itself.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think, this is this era in Spain of hardline reactionary political Catholicism. This is a set of ideas that a lot of contemporary, so-called trad Caths are trying to revive. This is when we kind of see it first attempted to put into practice in Europe, I would say.
Exactly. And I think that when we think about it, a good term that's often used is integrist or interrealist, which those familiar with political movements in Brazil in the 20th century might have heard of before. Essentially, it is a reaction to modernity in the sense of a reimposition and a strengthening of even what existed before of a connection between the church and the state. So it's not merely a continuation of what we can think of as early modern conceptions of the church-state relationship, but it is in fact it is a product of truly the modern era of the 20th century.
Yeah. And so as soon as the Second Republic is proclaimed, reactionary factions in the military and the church make it pretty clear they're not going to take this entire system lying down. They are openly disdainful of the new republic, and that a demonstration of monarchists singing monarchist songs led to street violence very soon after the Republic was proclaimed. This street violence escalated into yet more church burnings across Spain. Again, it really is the national pastime over there. And this 1931 wave of church burnings, despite being this, like we said, this very old tradition in Spain, began to be accused of being the work of foreign agitators, of Freemasons, of Russian Bolsheviks, all of that. And this wave of church burnings in 1931 really is part of this, spiraling escalation on both sides of this culture war that are shaping into the sides that are going to become the Spanish Civil War. So in 1933, as a result of this increased secularism and including these church burnings, you see the rise of the Catholic faction CEDA, the Confederación Española de Derechas Autónomas. It's the Confederation for Autonomous Rights. This is a strange group because it's not exactly integralist. It makes some token gestures toward anti-capitalism as a way to restore the faith of the impoverished peasantry, but really it's all about just destroying this government from within, not only because of its secular nature, but also because of its centralized nature, and turning the nation of Spain into a very decentralized, very Catholic country where the church has much more direct political control.
Yeah, basically they're trying to turn the clock back and make it caciquismo, but more Catholic this time.
Yeah, exactly. The Republicans in this time would call 1933 and 1934 the two black years of reactionary control, because the church had regained control electorally. They won an election, and now we're quickly working to dismantle the Republic from within. Spanish Republicans were also paying a lot of attention to what was going on in Germany at this time. They feared that the actions of the Catholic CEDA faction were mirroring what the Nazis were doing, dismantling the Weimar Constitution. In 1934, there was a violent uprising by Asturian miners against the Catholic-dominated government, which was only put down by the importation of Moroccan troops from the Rif region. So many of those Berber tribesmen who had bravely fought Spain in the 1920s were now offered this kind of amnesty deal where they could come to Spain and, fight for the Spanish government against Spanish workers.
Yeah, and then later on, they would be fighting against the Spanish government at the behest of Franco, who was, quite a big head in the Spanish military in North Africa. And I mean, you could argue that it was exactly the Moroccan regulares who helped to Franco to first gain a foothold in North Africa itself, and then finally to come to Spain to actually overthrow the government.
Right. And so because after these black years in which the Catholic Church has significant control, the uprising is put down, you see the left-wing factions of the Spanish government retake control of the parliament in 1936. But by this time, the reactionary side was clearly not going to accept any kind of electoral defeat. And you'll know much more about this than I do, James, but from what I understand, the left-wing election of the Popular Front pretty much immediately led to the Civil War, right?
Basically, yeah. That's was not much time, and certainly the Franco's military forces were preparing for almost the inevitable election of the Popular Front.
Yeah, and so what can you share about Francisco Franco at this time? I know because his background was that he had fought in the Rif War, like many of these guys. How did he come to power anyway in the 30s?
He had sort of this network of reactionary generals, because another big thing to think about in the Second Republic era is that the Republic had inherited a military bureaucracy that was incredibly, unbelievably bloated, especially of the officer corps. It was way oversized from anything reasonable, certainly compared to any other comparable country's military.
Yeah, I've looked into this before, and I think the statistic is something like there was an officer for like every 4 enlisted men, something like that.
Exactly, because the purpose essentially of this bloated officer corps was a make-work program for the second sons, especially of large landowners throughout Spain. And so what that meant was so much of the government budget was going to basically paying these people. One could think about it very cynically, paying them not to rise up against them. But once the Republic started moving against the military, what we can think of as the military aristocracy, essentially, it wasn't exactly completely hostile. You know, they were offering to basically buy them out of their contracts for not unreasonable amounts of money. But it was the loss of potential further income, as well as crucially that loss of prestige, that led so much of the Spanish officer corps to side with Franco. And additionally, we'll get into this later, but Franco did have sort of international connections with broader reactionary movements that helped physically get him from the island of the Canarias onto mainland Spain by airplane. And we'll talk about that later, but that this does involve sort of far-right English reactionaries.
And, you know, so before we see this international element, we begin to see many members of the Catholic movement who were not necessarily fascists welcoming this anti-democratic movement because they believe that the glory of the Catholic Church, that the sanctity of the Catholic Church is so important that if democracy is enabling the burning of these churches, we must end democracy. Ironically, the Desite movement, the biggest Catholic movement in Spain at this time, would be immediately destroyed by Franco when he took power.
Exactly. The political parties surrounding Franco would continue throughout eventually his victory and his regime to be a very murky and confusing topic for historians to this day to exactly parse out, because it wasn't quite something like, you know, the first decade or so of Mussolini, where, you know, you can clearly identify the fascist party. And eventually, of course, Mussolini takes on almost this Franco role as, you know, dissolving the party bodies and the Grand Council of Fascism and all that to further consolidate a much more personalist rule. But with Franco, it pretty immediately is a very personalist movement in that way.
All right, well, let's take a quick break right now, and then we're going to get into the international element here and looking at how international reactionary institutions, including the Catholic Church, helped Franco come to power. Fusil y una bandera, mi patria son mis hermanos que están labrando la tierra. Mi patria son mis hermanos que están labrando la tierra. Mientras aquí nos enseñan cómo se mata en la guerra. Ay que yo no tiro que no, ay que yo no tiro. Now, James, this is what you're here for. Tell us about the international Catholic reaction to the Spanish Civil War.
Sure. So this is culmination of many months of research, and I focused on specifically the Anglo-American Christian responses to the Spanish Civil War, which is something which, for those in the very small circle of people who are interested in any of the words I've just said, something that you will be excited to have noticed has been getting increasing attention in about the past decade or so. For a long time, especially in the UK is where a lot of this is coming out of. A lot of the focus has been on the participation of the trade unionist movement in the UK. And now people are starting to also look at, well, what were the, sort of the religious reactions to this? So I think a good reason why these two specific countries, the UK and specifically England and the United States at this time are so great to compare is that both of these countries pursued an official policy of neutrality throughout the war, and both ultimately recognized the Francoite government at the conclusion. Both are obviously overwhelmingly Christian societies with a Protestant majority as well as a sizable Catholic minority. These societies were very bitterly divided between Francoites and Republicans, with these divisions conforming to religious affiliation while still surprisingly cutting through them. Let's start with the United States. When we talk about American Francoites, supporters of the Francoist uprising, we are necessarily going to have to be talking about right-wing American Catholicism because, quite simply, the majority of American Francoites were Roman Catholics.
Yeah.
So in the United States in the 1930s, conservative Catholics lived in a state of political homelessness. The Democratic Party was the traditional home for urban Catholics and other immigrant communities.
Oh, yes. No. Our friend Grace Cathedral Park has a lot to say about the long Catholic history in the Democrats.
Precisely. However, at this time, we have to remember that it's the Roosevelt administration. So their policies, particularly the New Deal, were for many conservative Catholics sufficient evidence to conclude that the Democrats had been transformed into a socialist party. American Catholics still felt lingering distrust by much of the broader American society, deriving from religious prejudice as well as nativist sentiment against Catholic immigrant groups. On the other hand, American Catholics actually faced suspicion from Pope Pius XI in the Vatican because he felt that his American flock had been too corrupted by the ideals of Wilsonian liberalism. The war in Spain, therefore, gave conservative American Catholics the perfect opportunity to prove their loyalty to both their country and their church. The intertwined narratives of a patriotic anti-communism and a crusading spirit of religious devotion and a defense of ancient institutions allowed these men and women to feel that they were proving themselves simultaneously as truly American and truly Catholic in the face of suspicions that they were neither.
And I gotta say, this is a really interesting parallel to people like your great-grandfather. Americans and British and Irish people who volunteered for the Republican side because they thought it was also this international crusade for civilization over barbarism.
Precisely. And this is something that I really want to frame, that the story that I think we're telling on this episode is less so about the realities in Spain, because while all parties involved truly did care genuinely and sincerely about the developments in Spain, what is often really happening here is an argument between people in their own country, either in Britain or in America, about what the future of their own society was going to look like.
Yeah.
And you see this to this day, the way that the Spanish Civil War in particular is used to sort of serve as a proxy for a lot of ideological or religious arguments between those on the right and those on the left more broadly. So to get back to the American Francoists, they cast the Spanish counter-revolution of Franco in the light of the American War of Independence explicitly, with Franco playing the part, of course, of George Washington. The comparisons between Washington and Franco allowed these Catholic American Francoites to put themselves into the history of their own nation and its founding myth. In an attempt to come in from outside of the mainstream of American society, they felt it necessary to replace themselves with a new internal enemy to be shut out, denigrated as an internationalist foreign fifth column, and for this position, there was no easier candidate than the communists. Interestingly, I would point out that the communists at this time were doing precisely the same thing when they felt that they were cast out of the American mainstream of acceptable political discussions. The Communist Party of the United States, under General Secretary Earl Browder, did precisely this with his campaign of communism as the Americanism of the 21st century, most famously at the rally at Madison Square Garden, in which speeches were given in front of a giant wooden bust of President Lincoln.
No, Lincoln and Lenin side by side.
Precisely. And most famously, the American volunteers to the international brigades in Spain were called the Abraham Lincoln Battalion.
Yeah.
So the Spanish Civil War represented for American Francoites that communism was violent, godless, and had to be defeated in order to save Christendom. That FDR was seen as fraternizing with socialists in his New Deal coalition proved to these conservative American Catholics that liberalism was at its core accommodationist at best toward communism.
No, it was this international, there's this international outcry against these supposed atrocities by the Republicans against the Catholic Church. I can't even imagine if they had TikTok back then and Twitter, what the amount of right-wing slop about like churches burning, what that would look like,
Precisely. And we have that with the equivalent of TikTok slop of the 1930s, which of course is magazines and weekly and daily newspapers.
Yes.
But so that premise of liberalism being essentially accommodationist towards communism explains, at least in part, the hostility towards and the repeated narrative of the so-called liberal dupes, those who were rooked by Moscow, who simply couldn't see through the red propaganda about Spain. These weren't simply people who disagreed with them on fundamental questions of democracy and separation of church and state, or even social relations and economics. They had to have been manipulated and tricked, essentially, by Moscow. So the religious narrative of the war would also serve another key aim of Catholic American Francoites, which was to secure ecumenical support for the Francoite cause from Protestant brothers and sisters. By portraying communism...
Not just a Catholic thing.
Precisely. The fact that it was not, they claimed it was not simply opposed to the Catholic Church, it was opposed to religion. In the same way that we can talk about, the state atheist states of, well, at this time, I think just the Soviet Union. But by portraying communism...
Don't forget Mongolia, also Mongolia.
Of course. Although I'm not sure how concerned they were about the fate of Mongolian Buddhism. So by portraying communism as also representing not just a material threat to liberal democracy and capitalism, but a supernatural threat, Catholic American Francoites hope to bridge the divide between themselves and Protestant Americans to unite against the Republic.
Yeah, and then interestingly enough, during the Cold War itself, like this became like the central plank of America's propaganda of like, we are the religious people of the world against the godless communists who want to come into your society and subvert your religious values, be those Muslim values in the Middle East or Buddhist values in Vietnam.
Precisely. So before I dive deeper into the world of American Catholic Francoism, I want to first point out that right-wing American Catholic hostility to the Republican government existed before the war even started. To be certain, not insignificant part of this hostility was because of the fundamental constitutional changes which were brought about in the founding of the Second Republic in 1931, particularly the foundation of a secular form of government with the church removed from its traditional position as the established church of the state. This, not uncommon among Francoites, was often tied up with conspiratorial and anti-Semitic narratives of cabals of Jews and Freemasons, which again is a continuity that we've seen in Spain and abroad. For example...
Right. It's funny because Spain had one of the smallest Jewish populations in Europe at the time, but there was this widespread fear of supposed Jewish Bolshevik communists from Russia influencing Spanish politics.
Precisely. So, for example, the Tablet, not to be confused with the modern Jewish newspaper, which was an American Catholic newspaper, pretty influential, which was published out of Brooklyn, wrote in 1932 that the newly founded Second Republic was, quote, the successful criminal conspiracy of a little knot of Jewish, Masonic, socialist, and Bolshevik conspirators. It is tyranny by force and fraud. This obsession with the supposed Jewish nature of the Republic, which again, we must remember that in 1931, not only was the separation of church and state, there was also the explicit promulgation of the positive freedom of worship for those who were not Catholics, which, while certainly not a large population in Spain, were still significant enough to be constantly demonized by the Spanish right. So the approaching specter of socialists and communists in the government in the election of the Popular Front frightened the American Catholic press even more than the 1931 Constitution. Commonweal magazine, covering the February 1936 election, bemoaned the rise of what they called Spanish socialism, denouncing the Popular Front coalition as a child of Russian Bolshevism, who, if elected, would only bring about anarchy. Once the Popular Front was in fact elected, Commonweal was quick to declare that it was made up in its entirety of, quote, anti-Christian Republicans, socialists, and communists, and furthermore began casting aspersions on the legitimacy of the election itself, which would remain a popular accusation among Francoites, that the Popular Front was never legitimately elected. And therefore...
Right, because the whole thing was that, because the nationalists were overthrowing an election, so the best way to justify that is saying, actually, no, we're not overturning democracy, we are, in a sense, restoring democracy. It's a great lie. It's a really easy lie to make, because you don't ever need any evidence. So the leading Francoite organization in the United States was a group called Catholic Action, which was founded, coincidentally, in 1931 by the Catholic hierarchy. And when I talk about the Catholic hierarchy, for those who might not be familiar with the term, this means the bishops, the archbishops, essentially the clergy above the level of your parish priest. So with Catholic Action chapters springing up around the world, particularly to engage in political anti-communism, Pope Pius XI defined its purpose as to spread the kingdom of Christ, train its members to fight the Lord's battles, and aid the clergy in battles against anti-clericalism and, quote, deplorable religious indifference, both of which were obviously leading people to communism. And a frequent thing is this sort of martial language of the international Catholic right, because they really did see this as an existential war, which would soon break out into actual, armed conflict across Europe and maybe even the world. So Catholic Action used the network of Catholic publishing companies, such as the Paulist Press, the International Catholic Truth Society, and America Press, to produce pamphlets extolling the virtues of the Francoite cause and denouncing the Republic. Catholic Action cells, which were operated by laymen, or those who were not members of the clergy, engaged in what they called spiritual training against communism, organizing lectures, establishing community outreach programs, and forming study circles. For that last purpose, the study circles, many of the pamphlets produced by this organization came with discussion questions designed for use in study circles. And so this not only sounds like those who may be familiar with, if you've ever had to go to a Bible study or some sort of youth group, perhaps when you were a kid, but also many on the left may find this pattern pretty familiar. Oh, yeah. Lots of reading groups. Yes.
So one of the primary political outlets for Catholic American Francoites was organizing aid and charity programs to Francoite Spain. Unlike the Republicans, there was not really as big a focus on organizing actual armed detachments to go to Spain. A crucial thing to remember is that Francoite Spain had the military resources to draw on of Italy and Germany, whereas the Soviets could send some things to Republican Spain. However, it's a little bit harder simply because they're much further away than Italy and Germany were at this time. So one of the big famous aid organizations to Francoite Spain was something called the Spanish Relief Committee of San Francisco, which used money raised from magazine and pamphlet sales, lecture tours, and donation drives. The bi-monthly magazine Spain, founded in 1937, ran frequent ads for rescuing refugee children in Francoite-held territory. Unlike organizing volunteers for the Francoite military, American Francoites instead focused on lobbying the United States government on issues such as maintaining official neutrality and upholding the embargo on Spain. Because there was at this time an arms embargo on Spain, which made supplying either side difficult. However, of course, Germany and Italy were much more easily able to get around these sorts of embargoes. So American Francoite literature, or what we might call propaganda, from pamphlets to books, held to a very consistent and precise message by design. Firstly, its author would construct a frame of impartiality and then establish authority through eyewitness testimony, academic learning, religious authority, and then use conspiratorial logic, essentially, to claim that any contradicting information was a lie invented by the enemy who had infiltrated society and the government. It tended to cast aspersions on the mainstream understanding of the war in Spain, with implications that the mainstream press and general public opinion was captured by communist propaganda efforts, as well as hostility to Catholics and Christianity as a whole, which is something which we see obviously in the Cold War era with groups such as the John Birch Society, who seem to believe that all mainstream American press was effectively ran by communists.
No, we discussed them. We discussed the Birchers at length in a few other episodes. I think they really are a really important element in modern right-wing crankery.
Absolutely. And you can see so many parallels today. So eyewitness narrative specifically would be one of the most popular forms of Francoite propaganda. And they were usually written by non-Catholic Europeans. So the non-Catholicism of these authors were highlighted in the American Francoite press.
You mentioned a lot of British Anglican fascist types were very pro-Franco as well.
Precisely. So their non-Catholicism was highlighted in the press in order to promote that vision of a pan-Christian alliance against the Republic. One of the most famous European travel narratives was Eleanor Tennant's Spanish Journey, but others included Elizabeth Dilling, who was a fascist-adjacent, isolationist, anti-communist American Episcopalian, Eileen O'Brien, a former Red Cross worker in Francoite territory and an American Catholic, and Merwin K. Hart, who was the president of the New York State Economic Council and an American Episcopalian. So these travel narratives took place almost entirely in Francoite territory and focused on praising public adoration for Franco, the Francoite government welfare programs, and downplaying or even outright denying any Francoite reprisals against Republicans who were known or suspected of being so.
Right. No, because we have to mention, obviously, that there was a lot of destruction of church property, and there were also killings of church members by the Republicans, but there were plenty of massacres, many more massacres, in fact, by the Francoist side, even occasionally massacres of clergy who supported the Republican cause.
Precisely. So on a more micro level, where I'm recording from right now, the Archdiocese of Boston, I think is a really great example of the relationship that existed between the clergy and the press regarding the development of that Francoite policy. So the Archbishop at that time was a man named Cardinal William O'Connell, who is described as a blunt, authoritative, and decisive Irish American who considered himself the official spokesman of the Boston Catholic community, who was very conservative and ultramontane in outlook. Ultramontane meaning they believe in the ultimate complete authority of the Pope in all matters, and really just a centralization of all clerical power within the seat of St. Peter. So O'Connell spoke publicly about the Spanish Civil War on 3 occasions. Firstly, in June of 1937, to criticize a plan to bring a group of Basque refugee children to the United States, which he and others claimed was a Protestant plot in order to brainwash these Basque children out of their Catholicism. It's as absurd as it sounds. His second O'Connell episode here is in December 1937, when he praised the Catholic press for refuting the lies the American Republican press had been publishing on the war. And finally, in March of 1938, to officially announce his personal support for Francisco Franco, which caused a massive media stir across the East Coast. So this final incident occurred when O'Connell was approached by journalists as he arrived in New York City following his annual winter vacation to the Bahamas. He was asked his opinion on the reports of the Francoite bombing of civilians in Barcelona, where he dismissed it as either a lie or, if true, a necessary military maneuver, or, if unnecessary, then a justified crime to end the war. O'Connell took umbrage with the reporters referring to Franco as a rebel, insisting he was a defender of Christianity. Reporters then asked him to comment on Franco's alliance with Mussolini and Hitler, where he declared there was no reason for Franco not to accept their help, and even went further by stating, quote, if the Italians and Germans like fascism because it saved their civilization for them, That is their business. O'Connell concluded by connecting communists in Spain to the moral corruption of the youth and women of America through dress and indecent conduct by American Bolsheviks. So certainly O'Connell is, while extremely powerful, of course, in one of the most Catholic cities in the United States, an absolute lunatic when it comes to reality. The diocesan newspaper, which is to say the newspaper put out by the Archdiocese of Boston, called the Boston Pilot, was one of the most widely quoted Catholic conservative newspapers in America. And O'Connell considered it to be his own personal publication, taking great lengths to assure that its printed views reflected his own. So the Pilot supported Franco with a lot of fervor from the very beginning of the war, even printing interviews with Franco himself. It denied any atrocities committed by the Francoists because since Franco and his soldiers were such pious Catholics, it was literally impossible for them to engage in any of the crimes that they were being accused of.
Was there any attention drawn to the fact that they were so heavily reliant on Muslim troops, or did that just not feature in this American Catholic propaganda?
So it did not feature in international Catholic propaganda. However, it was seized upon by the international supporters of the Republic as a clear hypocrisy of the so-called pious Catholic, making this alliance with, these Muslim barbarians, essentially, which, of course, discourse about the role of the Moorish troops in the Spanish Civil War often has this uncomfortable tinge of sort of a racial understanding.
Yes.
However, these troops truly were brutal. Franco's forces would use them to explicitly bring about mass terror campaigns through directing them to enter buildings with many women and, commit horrific violence against them. So from 1937 to 38, the Boston Pilot devoted more print space to the persecution of the church in Spain than any other topic. It's important to note that the most violent persecution of the church had, for the most part, subsided after the long, hot summer of 1936. But the Pilot's coverage gave the impression of unabated attacks throughout the war. The Pilot's main source for news on Spain was the Vatican's official newspaper, Osservatore Romano, or the Roman Observator, as well as the News Bureau of the National Catholic Welfare Conference, which was the official outlet of the American Catholic bishops, and the Pilot would often simply reprint these stories verbatim. Pius XI published an encyclical in 1937 entitled On Atheistic Communism. And when that was translated into English, the Pilot wasted no time reprinting it, praising its analysis of communism as the cause of Spanish persecution, and that its ultimate goal was the destruction of religion itself. When a group of American Protestant ministers complained of being unable to practice their faith in Francoite territory, the Pilot accused them not only of being allied with communism, but that there was no suppression of Protestantism at all whatsoever within Francoite Spain. This, of course, is a complete lie, and the suppression of the small but meaningful Protestant community in Spain continued throughout the Francoite era. For example, if you were a Protestant church in Francoite Spain, you were not allowed to have a sign in front of your building announcing that it was a church. So it was 1939.
Really?
Yes.
Because only a Catholic church is a true church. Everything else is just, this altar of Satan.
Precisely. So as 1939 approached, getting towards the end of the war, and world opinion began mounting against Franco, who was then offering peace only through unconditional surrender. The Pilot criticized the Republic for not taking the deal, and even went further by saying it hoped Franco would not allow the communists any rights at all once the war was over. So I would be remiss if I didn't address the rampant anti-Semitism common to these Francoite narratives of the war. I already mentioned the tablets reference to the Jewish Masonic Second Republic, but they were far from the only group to describe the Republic in such a manner. When American Francoites were charged with Jew baiting, they tended to claim that they were simply opposed to communists, not Jews, although that certainly didn't stop them from singling out Jews as uniquely involved in the global Bolshevik plot. For example, as some American volunteers from the International Brigades began returning home in 1938, the Jesuit magazine America characterized them as mostly Jewish or otherwise foreign-born riffraff.
I mean, to be fair, they were like half Jewish and a bunch of others were like of foreign descent. So
you never want to say they're right, but the American Jewish community had an extremely disproportionate percentage of the international.
It's our national pastime. We love being overrepresented in things.
But the whole thing here, it's entirely to discredit it. It's to argue that there's this, this satanic Jewish conspiracy. That's the only reason that's why they're highlighting this.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Yes. Where American Jews, particularly in official capacities, either in newspapers, magazines, or official statements from, synagogue federations, did speak out about the war in Spain, it was decidedly on the side of the Republic, explicitly because they said, well, under a Francoite regime, Jews would have no rights. So therefore, we're going to side with the side that would grant rights to non-Catholics.
Yeah, that's So it's completely understandable.
Exactly. So the national Catholic magazine, The Sign, wrote toward the end of the war that it hoped a victorious Franco would, quote, be a good enough Christian to forget the hostility of world Jewry in his hour of need and will oppress any attempted reprisals. But that if he fails in this, the Jews of the world should remember it was they and not he who declared war. Obviously, any mention of the phrase...
And we have to remember, this is 1939 when this is being published. The context of global anti-Semitism here is so grotesque that these American Christians are fanning the flames.
Exactly. There is no real way that there could be any plausible deniability that they were not directly connected to this international campaign against Jews. Obviously, it's never a good sign when anyone uses the phrase world Jewry to begin with, but certainly not when you're saying stuff like that. So obviously no discussion of American Catholic anti-Semitism in the 1930s would be complete without mentioning Father Charles Coughlin, whose radio program had 30 million listeners at its peak in the mid-1930s. And whose magazine...
that's like 20% of the American population at the time, to be clear.
It's astounding. So his magazine, Social Justice, was also extremely widely read, including by one John McCormick, the congressional representative from South Boston and Franco's most important lobbyist in Washington. On Spain specifically, Coughlin once compared the mainstream news coverage of the persecution of Spanish clergy to its coverage of the Kristallnacht, saying that in both cases, the facts were distorted by the owners of the American media.
Which obviously is,
Jews.
Yeah, not really subtle there.
He was not a subtle man. It should be stated that not all American Catholics were supporters of the Francoite cause. It's estimated that nearly 1/3 of American Catholics opposed the church's pro-Francoite position. Liberal Catholics tended not to support...
Yeah, because these are Americans who live in a democracy and had this general rightful hostility toward these kinds of fascistic policies even before World War II.
Precisely. And as I mentioned earlier, Pope Pius XI did have good reason to suspect that many American Catholics had been corrupted by Wilsonian liberalism, in the sense that they believed that the government in which they were born into and lived and worked was in fact a legitimate form of government and shouldn't be replaced with a monarchy. Liberal Catholics tended not to support Franco, but they often were hesitant over supporting the Republic because of these fears regarding the persecution of the church in Spain. So an interesting example of this American Catholic dissent can be found in the story of a writer named George Schuster and Commonweal, which I've mentioned earlier, which is a broadly progressive Catholic lay magazine. Especially today. But Schuster was an editor at Commonweal, and in 1936, in the summer, he penned an editorial stating that he doubted that the rebelling, quote, military cabal would be able to resolve the deep-rooted and numerous problems of Spanish society, and that the rebellion was only a nightmarish incident, and that there was no reason for stridently applauding the present rebels. Certainly not a full-throated endorsement of the Republic by any means, but merely a fairly reasonable statement that the Francoite forces would not be able to fix all of these long-standing and festering problems in Spanish society. This caused an absolute uproar among the American hierarchy, as well as the readers of the magazine. The Archbishop of Cincinnati banned the sale of the magazine in all churches within his jurisdiction. The Chancery of the Archbishop...
Really?
Yep. And then the chancery of the Archdiocese of New York began a pressure campaign against the magazine to reverse its stance. And the magazine's already precarious financial situation was threatened by a large number of canceled subscriptions, particularly those from the clergy.
Cancel culture strikes again.
Big picture here. It's fair to say that the American church, Catholic Church leadership from top to bottom, is it fair to say they were Francoist?
It's certainly fair to say that they did not think that any public condemnation or questioning of the Francoite cause was appropriate. I think it's a bit historically contentious to say for sure from top to bottom, but I would certainly say that overwhelmingly the hierarchy were Francoites. Whether or not they wanted to import Francoism to America is another question, but certainly they loved it in Spain.
So the most opposition that Catholic Americans would hear would maybe be their parish priest, but not their bishop or archbishop even.
They probably wouldn't even hear it from their parish priest. Realistically, they would have to hear it from regular mainstream media and politicians and general society. But those official publications of the church, especially in that first year, you're not really hearing any major questioning of these Francoite narratives. So the owner and founder of the magazine, a man named Michael Williams, was worried that Commonweal would collapse unless it reversed course immediately. And that meant Schuster had to go. The change at Commonweal was gradual, but soon it was parroting all of the same talking points as the rest of the Catholic publications, accusing every publication opposed to Franco of playing the communist game and publishing staunch Francoites like Father Owen B. McGuire and Nita Belmonte. Williams, for his part, was increasingly physically ill from his severe alcoholism, as well as his fanatic devotion to Franco, being seen at Francoite rallies exuberantly chanting prayers of St. Teresa in the aisles. There was still some degree of dissent under Williams' leadership, particularly among its younger generation of writers, who would congregate at parties with such anti-Francoite Catholic intellectual giants as Jacques Maritain, and came up with a plan to buy out Williams' shares to gain control of the magazine. Williams, by this point in failing health and deeply depressed by the failure of a large Francoite rally he staged at Madison Square Garden, agreed to the sale. The new owners immediately got to work on publishing an editorial announcing the magazine's new official position on Spain. They said that refighting the war in this country among people who did not have all the facts would only serve to further divide Catholics from other Americans, and the magazine was choosing to promote positive impartiality toward the war in order to promote unity.
So they still were not condemning Franco in any sense. They were just no longer endorsing him.
Which was the position, effectively, of those like Maritain. So much like Schuster's original editorial, this was met with a flood of negative letters to the editors and an almost immediate reduction of subscriptions by 25%.
Yeah. Catholic grannies in Minnesota were so mad that they were no longer endorsing Franco, that they were canceling their subscription. Yeah.
It was, and the magazine, like I said before, had always been pretty financially unstable. So this was a pretty brutal blow. Because it had no public support from any clerical leaders, it was the target of attacks from the rest of the Catholic press, including America, which is the Jesuit magazine here, the magazine of the Passionist Fathers, The Sign, Notre Dame's Ave Maria, Denver's Catholic Register, Coughlin's Social Justice, and numerous diocesan newspapers, with the exception of Chicago's Franco-skeptical New World magazine. Only 2 members of the hierarchy supported the new stance, and only privately. Cardinal George Mundelein, again Archbishop of Chicago, and Bishop Edwin V. O'Hara of Kansas City. So another dissenting famous Catholic publication would be the Catholic Worker, the flagship publication of the eponymous social justice organization founded by Dorothy Day. Drawing from its own principles of Christian pacifism, as well as the writings of Maritain, the Catholic Worker condemned Franco's rebellion while also taking, again, a neutralist stance on the war. Maritain, who was published by both the Catholic Worker as well as the Commonweal following that change in ownership, was attacked as a French nationalist and a communist dupe by the Denver Catholic Register.
Again, the dupes again.
It's the constant dupes. They keep getting tricked. So he's getting attacked by Denver Catholic Register, the Boston Pilot, the Catholic Digest, Ave Maria, and Tablet for his position of simple neutrality. One diocesan priest from Long Island, a Father Henry Palmer, came to his defense, writing a letter to the editor of Tablet criticizing its harsh and unfair treatment of Maritain, Day, and Schuster, and arguing that the Francoites were driving people away from the church, not bringing them back into it. On the other side of the Tiber, American Protestants, by contrast, were largely Republican in outlook. The election of the Popular Front was met with cheers from both the Boston Universalist journal, The Christian Leader, as well as that mainline flagship publication, The Christian Century, both of which praised Spain from having been saved from fascism. By the end of that first July, Christian Century was describing the Francoites as a fascist monarchist revolt against the socialist government of the Popular Front. By early August, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ publication, The Christian Evangelist, had published an editorial in which it decried the blanket labeling of the Popular Front as communist, as it had been propagated by the, quote, forces of black reaction, the fascist, militarist, clerical landowning groups, which had halted progress for centuries and which considered it their duty to serve God by halting progress in this century. Furthermore, the article went on to claim that the violence against the Catholic Church was because, quite understandably, the Spanish people have accepted the Catholic Church in their country as a symbol of everything reactionary, privileged, and plutocratic. He even went so far as to compare the historical roles of the Catholic Church in Spain and the Orthodox Church in Russia, saying that they both had been servants of the oppressors.
Yeah. I think the fact that these Protestant publications and official churches, were saying this should totally put to bed this idea some Twitter people have that the Catholic Church is based in leftist, whereas Protestants are reactionary. There are certainly many contexts in which Protestants are reactionary and Catholics are more progressive, particularly when it comes to immigrant politics in the 19th century, or maybe a little bit of, post-war labor stuff in the 50s, 60s, 70s. But it is not an effective rule of thumb. And I think we really have to move past this one. I was wondering if we could maybe move ahead to what was going on in Britain at this time, because I think that, from what I understand, the British support for Franco was actually more instrumental in not just cheering on the war, but actually helping Franco succeed in establishing his rule over Spain.
So across the Atlantic, the positions of the Catholic hierarchy in press in the United Kingdom was, unsurprisingly, quite similar to its American counterpart. The major Catholic weeklies in Britain overwhelmingly supported the Francoites, and with the exception of those who were inclined towards socialism, most British Catholic commentators perceived the Spanish Civil War as primarily an attack on Christian civilization from communist atheism. And now I do want to point out that is a very important difference between American society and British society at that time, is that you had many more people in Britain in the 1930s who were willing to self-identify and self-consciously consider themselves socialists, which meant that there was somewhat right. Because think about there were many aspects of the Labour Party who sincerely considered themselves socialists and therefore were willing to go a bit further than many of the liberal publications in the United States at that time. So within the first few months of the war, the British Catholic press was already decidedly Francoite. Father Joseph Keating, who was the priest and editor of the Jesuit magazine The Month, declared in August 1936 that the war was primarily moral and religious, between the godless tyranny inspired by Marx and the Catholicism, which is the guardian of civil and political rights as well as the rights of God. He further stated that the Antichrist is abroad in Spain, attempting to destroy religion, and was being aided by both Soviet Russia as well as socialist France.
Yeah, I think it's so funny. This is actually not that dissimilar from language you see in Spain in the 17th century about how you have the German Lutherans and the Muslim Moors conspiring to destroy the Spanish Empire.
Exactly. So that same month, the English weekly The Tablet was already saying that all Spaniards who wish to see this church survive would have to side with Franco. By September, although it would later adopt a neutralist stance, the Dominican famous monthly Blackfriars wrote in September 1936 that Spain was being gripped by a red terror, which could easily spread outside of Spanish borders, and the war was not a civil war between political factions, but instead between church and antichrist. Partly as a reflection of the greater support which fascism as an ideology had enjoyed among certain segments of British society, there was even greater support for fascism as well as the fascist governments on the continent among British Catholics than their American counterparts. The Bishop of Southwark, Peter Amigo, was a vocal supporter of fascist Italy. In 1929, a forged letter purportedly by Amigo was sent to the priests of the archdiocese attacking fascism and urging them to join anti-fascist organizations. When Amigo found out about this, he immediately contacted the Italian consulate in London to say he had no part in the letter.
I have to say, Peter Amigo is a completely unserious name.
Peter Amigo is... I had to double check about 5 times when I first read about this guy that there was a man named Peter Amigo. So in 1936, he, like many of the Catholic clergy, openly supported the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, which led to a lot of hostility to him in the general London press. Tablet frequently published articles sympathizing with Italy and Germany, saying that they ought to be recognized as defensive against communism, and that the Catholic Church should make its peace with fascism the same way it did with liberal democracy in the 19th century. In 1938, the magazine The Month wrote regarding the alliance between Francoites and Germany and Italy that only these two, Italy and Germany, of the major European powers have taken the menace of atheist communism seriously, and that in opposing communists, they are fighting the battle of democracies as well. One of the boldest attempts at propaganda of the entire war came from a man named Douglas Francis Gerald, who was an avowed fascist. He was an editor of a magazine called The English Review and was even a conspirator in Franco's July plot to begin his rebellion. He helped get him on the plane to Spain. Gerald wrote in 1938 regarding reports of Francoite atrocities that it is not true that there have been fewer atrocities on one side than on the other. There have been no atrocities on the nationalist side.
Yeah, and I'm sure if you pressured him on this, if you point out the massacres and the rapes committed by the nationalists, he would say, oh, those don't count because the victims aren't people. They're godless communists.
Precisely. It would be the same thing that O'Connell said, where he said, it didn't happen, but if it did happen, it was necessary. And if it wasn't necessary, then they deserved it anyway. Mm-hmm. So the Archbishop of Westminster is a position that not only includes jurisdiction over the province of Westminster, but also is the chief metropolitan of England and Wales, which means that
just to clarify, this is the Catholic Archbishop of Westminster, correct? You don't mean the more famous Anglican. Okay, yeah.
No, he is the chief cleric over English and Welsh Catholic.
Kind of like a shadow government position.
Certainly many in England historically would have called it that. The Archbishop during this period was a man named Arthur Hinsley, who was really concerned with the events in Spain. And in the estimation of the British historian Tom Villas, was virtually a propagandist for the Francoites. British Catholics who urged the Archbishop to use less partisan campaigning, or who were on the left themselves, were dealt very curtly by his office, such as the British Committee for Civil and Religious Peace in Spain, when they simply asked him to condemn all aerial raids on civilians in Spain. Of course, the reality was almost all aerial raids upon civilians were being committed by the Francoites. Additionally, he accused José de Lizaso and Manuel de Erojo of being liars when they requested condemnation of Francoite abuses in Bilbao, as well as of the Francoite execution of a Basque Catholic youth leader named Javier de Artaza Goya. In response to a 1938 open letter signed by several high-profile English Catholics, such as Labour MP David Adams, Margaret Clayton, editor of The Sower, Father S.J. Gosling, the artist Eric Gill, and Monica Watley, more about her later, asking him to condemn Francoite aerial bombardments, the Archbishop accused them of exhibiting a lack of loyalty, as well as having fallen for red propaganda, saying there was no evidence which enabled him to reach a conclusion that attacks have been made by the forces of nationalist Spain on the civilian population. Just like in the U.S., there were dissenters within the British Catholic press. Again, Blackfriars eventually adopted a neutralist stance, writing in the autumn of 1936 that it was fundamentally unchristian for all Catholics to be compelled to side immediately with the Francoites and to have no sympathy for the Spanish masses who wished to resist what they saw as an oppressive, murderous, and reactionary tyranny. Furthermore, it suggested that the war itself could have been avoided if the church had simply carried out the social encyclicals issued from the Vatican. The Sower, which was a British Catholic journal popular among Catholic trade unionists, lambasted the Catholic press for promoting fascist propaganda and arguing that they were bringing Catholicism into disrepute among the working class. In response to that, Tablet responded that by claiming that anti-fascists were simply communists seeking to destroy European peace, and that there was no reason why fascism and democracy should be an either-or choice. So finally, we come to the Protestants of Britain, who occupied an even more majoritarian position in Britain than in America. Most of these were Anglican, but certain areas had strong numbers of nonconformists, who are Protestants who simply belong to other Protestant denominations than the Church of England. Just like their Catholic countrymen, British Protestants had their own institutional ties to Spanish co-religionists. And here I want to explain, because a lot of people will be very surprised to hear that there were Spanish Protestants. So in the Mediterranean world, we can think of Italy and Spain as the two main places that had at one time Protestants. Italy had Protestant communities which dated to or even preceding.
Yeah, no, you mentioned the Waldensians. We discussed them a couple episodes ago. Yeah,
exactly. The Waldensians, by I believe the 16th century, had come to adopt Calvinist Reformed theology and effectively operated as a Reformed church in Italy. However, there were also pockets of Lutheranism. Particularly, these things existed in the north of Italy. They were never a majority and were always quite small, largely because of the close proximity of the Vatican, who could maintain, order, as it were, within Italy. Mm-hmm. In Spain, there was no trace of any indigenous Spanish Protestantism, which, of course, there were. One can think of the borderlands between France and Spain gave France one of its most famous kings, who converted from Reformed.
Henry of Navarre.
Exactly. Converted from being a Calvinist to being a Catholic. So in Spain, however, those communities have been wiped out because of the long, brutal Inquisition, which is so famous, which not only targeted Muslims and Jews, but also any other religious dissenters, which usually meant Protestants. So throughout the 19th century, there had been largely British-led Protestant missions of varying denominations throughout the Mediterranean world, to both Italy as well as Spain, where they had managed to establish some respectable Protestant communities throughout the 19th century who were surviving, not very largely, but certainly thriving in their own terms into the 1930s, especially some Reformed members, some Low Church Anglicans, as well as some Methodists. So the World's Evangelical Alliance, a British Protestant group founded to a large degree in opposition to the high church movement of Anglo-Catholicism within the Church of England, established an affiliate status in 1913 with the Alianza Evangélica Española, or the Spanish Evangelical Alliance, to defend against religious intolerance towards Protestants in that country. When this Spanish Republic was declared, the WEA's chairman, Henry Martin Gooch, praised it for its commitment to the separation of church and state, the promotion of religious liberty, and crucially, the promotion of literacy. He believed that the combination of religious liberty and increased literacy rates will result in more people reading the Bible on their own, and therefore being more receptive to Protestantism, of course. He wrote in the November-December issue in 1936 of Evangelical Christendom about reports he had received from Spanish Protestant refugees, relaying stories of persecution of Protestants in Francoist territory, and the considerable freedom enjoyed in Republican territory, such as Catalonia. He relayed a very interesting anecdote that a Catalonian mob had set fire to a Protestant church, believing it to be a Catholic one. However, the mob helped put out the fire upon being informed of its true ownership.
Oh, that's funny. Well, and that's the thing. It's just that anti-clericalism was really about specifically the alliance between the landowners and the Catholic Church, and the fact that when the fascists attempted to take over, it was seen as this reassertment of, traditional semi-feudal privilege.
Exactly. Which really flies in the face of the idea of the Spanish Republic attempting to do some great state atheist wiping out of all religion.
Yeah, absolutely.
So he also reported in late 1937 that there had long been reports of banishment, imprisonment, and execution of several Spanish Protestant ministers, including the jailing of a minister in Salamanca for seeming to be, quote, half a socialist. In early 1937, the first British Protestant fact-finding mission was organized on an interdenominational line. It consisted of 3 Anglicans, a Methodist, and a Quaker. They quickly found that there was not a Soviet-style organized attack on religion or Christianity as such, directly challenging those reports in the right-wing Catholic press, as well as right-wing secular papers like the Daily Mail. On the question of anti-clericalism, they claimed first and foremost that it didn't find the government responsible for the violence, but that it was mob violence, noting that it targeted members of religious orders more than secular priests, often beginning when mobs discovered large amounts of money inside the order's buildings.
Did these British fact finders, did they actually fly to Spain during the war to investigate?
Yeah, they did. And they were, unlike, as I'll discuss later, fact-finding missions which went to Francoite territory. In Republican territory, you were not limited in your movement, and you were not required, crucially, to submit all your writings to an official government censor before it could be allowed to leave the country. So this really opened up, these fact-finding missions, which, would all arrive in Spain at the same time, and then their members would generally split up and go to different areas in Spain and talk to maybe Spanish Protestants who they had exchanged letters with, to meet with government ministers, and in general to just talk to regular people and figure out what was going on. So Henry Carter, who was the Methodist member of this, what's called the Duncan Jones mission, wrote a very extensive report on his findings. So he wrote of the vast illiteracy he witnessed among the population, which, as an educator, completely appalled him, and which he blamed on the Catholic Church in Spain. He met with Spanish Methodists and characterized the conflict as between an old Spain and a new Spain. Interestingly, although I'm not sure how receptive the government was, he did write down his own suggestions for post-war reforms in Spain, including a Swiss-style confederate structure for religious freedom, thorough land reform, industrial reorganization, and a comprehensive modern education system. He received some backlash from conservatives within Methodist circles for this report. Sir Henry Lunn, whose son will come up later, who was a Methodist former missionary, wrote scathingly in the Methodist Recorder in 1937 about the delegation's report and Carter's articles, criticizing him for failing to visit both Republican and Francoite areas. But as I said before, Carter defended himself by saying the Francoite government had failed to guarantee freedom of movement and reporting that the Francoites had been able to do. In March 1937, there was a second Protestant delegation, which was even more partisan for the Republic. It was headed by the fascinating Reverend Hewlett Johnson, known as the Red Dean, due to his position as the Dean of Canterbury, as well as his openly communist politics.
Oh, wow. And again, it's completely destroying the idea that, Catholics are the lefty ones.
Precisely. So in majority Anglican dismission, it also included 2 nonconformists as well as 2 Roman Catholics. As I said, it was even more partisan than the first one, with most, if not all, of its members belonging to the left. This include the Anglican Reverend Elliot Ostraham Iredell, who was vicar of St.
Great name.
Excellent name. Vicar of the also greatly named St. Clement's Bardensbury in Islington, London, which was known to some as the Red Church. He was a very frequent writer on the Republican cause, and once concluded Sunday service with a raised right fist in front of the altar, and would collect funds at the parish for aid to the Republican government, specifically to buy weapons.
Wow.
Some of the nonconformist evangelicals were D.R. Davies, a former Congregationalist minister and member of the Socialist League, as well as the great Scottish philosopher John McMurray. One of the Catholic delegates was Monica Whatley, who just earlier that month...
Yeah, who you mentioned previously.
Yeah, so Monica Whatley is a fascinating person who was just earlier that month elected to the London County Council for the Labour Party. She was a graduate of the London School of Economics, an anti-racist, a socialist, and a suffragette. and it was no surprise when she declared herself firmly a Republican. In the first few weeks of the war, she printed and distributed Republican pamphlets at her parish door at St. Mary's in Clapham Park, much to the anguish of the Bishop of Southwark and other Francoites.
Well, so how did this second fact-finding mission differ from the first one? Is this the one that you said actually went into Francoist territory?
No, so neither of them went into Francoist territory. The main difference is that this second one was way more partisanly left. The first one was fairly centrist and apolitical and was really focused on the plight of the Spanish Protestants. This one was really a left-wing, but a left-wing religious effort. So unsurprisingly, it claimed that it expected a victorious Republican government to reopen the churches, which had been closed, to enshrine religious toleration, and to give the Catholic Church in Spain a chance to reconcile itself to a new democratic Spain. Perhaps the most interesting consequence of this mission is that it gave Johnson the opportunity to witness firsthand the infamous Francoite aerial bombardment of the Basque city of Durango. While the destruction was still being reported through Francoite sources as being the result of Republicans detonating ground-based explosives, Johnson managed to get himself access to a radio microphone and deliver the first eyewitness report confirming it was indeed the Francoites. However, just as among Protestant right-wingers in the United States, there were plenty of British Protestants who were decidedly not Republican. Chief among these was Henry Lunn, who in the summer of 38 founded the United Christian Front, a Francoite organization which, as its name suggested, was meant to serve as a platform for a pan-Christian Francoism. Joined by other ecumenically minded Protestant right-wingers, he also won the support of the organization from the Archbishop of Westminster. One of the members of this group was Lunn's own son, Arnold, who had converted to Catholicism earlier in the decade. He had by that time become not only an accomplished mountain skier, but also a fascist sympathizer of Mussolini's Italy, as well as a prolific propagandist for the Francoist.
He would have the most annoying Twitter account today.
Absolutely atrocious, atrocious vibes from this guy.
No, man, I've met this guy, and I cannot think of a worse person.
It really is just incredible that we keep reinventing the same kinds of guys. Like, it's been a century. Can we please, find a new type of person already?
In a pamphlet that he wrote in 1937, this younger Lunn wrote how the Spanish Reds are much amused by the ease with which the American and Protestant swallow their propaganda. But that there are also many old-fashioned Protestants who believe that even priests should be given a sporting chance to die in their beds, as opposed to, I assume, at the end of a bayonet. So he goes on to quote his father, who compared the UCF's cause with Wilberforce and Gladstone's moral appeals over the slave trade and the Bulgarian uprising of 1876.
Support for Franco is comparable to abolition?
Yep. There was no shame among any of these people, truly. At the end of the day, the Francoites won in Spain, and the US and the UK both won in their quest to maintain neutrality and eventually bestow recognition to the Francoist government. The Catholic Church in Spain would continue to support Franco until it felt it was no longer expedient, and it would take the generational death of his Cold War supporters like Arnold Lunn, Patrick Scanlon, and John McCormick for Anglophone Francoism to finally die in its bed. In the US, returning volunteers were met with the Second Red Scare and the beginnings of McCarthyism, deterring many from speaking too loudly in favor of the memory of the Republic. This was a little different in the UK, where the trade unionist movement kept the spark much more alive, with memorials found across the country for its volunteers. The horrors of the Second World War and the Holocaust would bring the church into a firm, at least official, repudiation of fascism and Nazism. And the era following the Second Vatican Council saw the church engage with the questions of democracy and social justice, which had been discussed in Protestant circles for decades by that point. The Jesuits in America transformed from the shock troops of fascist propaganda to the relatively cuddly liberals of the church we know today.
Yeah, so that's when they became based and surprisingly left-wing.
That is when they became based and surprisingly left-wing, precisely. And so as we think about the church today and its relationship to Spanish democratic memory, we can think about an episode in 2006, which coincidentally is the same time that the government of Spain is promoting what it calls the Democratic Memory Law, which seeks to finally engage with the legacy of the dictatorship in the Civil War. At that same time, Pope Benedict XVI staged one of the largest ceremonies publicly for the beatification of a number of clergy who were killed by Republican forces or sympathetic mobs. Notably absent, of course, were those who could be said to be martyred by the Francoite regime, either throughout its existence or, crucially, the many members of the clergy who were killed by the Francoites for refusing to support them. And so later, Pope Francis would continue to beatify members of the so-called Spanish martyrs. And while the church officially in Spain has stated that it wants to move past and seek forgiveness for its part in promoting and stoking such a brutal war, the church really does have a long way to go, like in many places in the world, at actually making restitution, amends, and crucially, fundamental changes in how it sees its own history.
Well, thank you, James. This is just such a big topic, and that the amount of detail you've brought to the table is just really incredible. I think it's just this, like we said, like the fact that the Catholic Church is this ancient institution grappling with these social changes, often in these horrific ways, is just such a fundamentally interesting topic. What do you think the international Catholic perspective in favor of this brutal Francoist regime, what do you think that says about the position of the church more broadly and its political orientation today?
I think that one of the most necessary things in the history of the Catholic Church was fundamentally the Second Vatican Council. Officially, the position of the Church, of the papacy, of the majority of the cardinals, is that there was not a rupture, but a continuity with the pre-Vatican II Church. This is largely to counter a lot of conservative arguments, well, arch-conservative, by people who we see online claiming that there hasn't been a valid pope since 1950 or 1930 or 1890 or whatever year you think the church became too woke, essentially. But really, Vatican II was sort of, after the absolute horrors of the Second World War, there really was no room left on that runway for the church to keep going in that way, where it still refused to fully come to terms with even liberalism, which it had nominally done by the end of the 19th century, but as we see in Spain, clearly wasn't. Realistically, I think, to paraphrase the Argentine himself, perhaps we need 2, 3, many Vaticans, councils. But realistically, I think what it represents is that fundamentally the Catholic Church, especially in the context of European politics, continues to represent, to varying degrees based on archdiocese, even parish, certainly by country, how much of an opposition to economic, political, and social progress from these really backwards and horrific years and centuries of life in which, there was not this focus on, human dignity and human freedom, which, of course, the church and the post-Vatican II era talks a lot about things like human dignity and liberalism, but I don't know. All I know is that if the next pope takes the name Pius, we should all settle in for a rough couple of years.
All right. Well, thank you, James. I think on that note, that is a great place to end with. Let's hope. All right. Let's hope. Maybe we'll get a Pope impious,
or maybe it's going to be a young pope type of thing. You never know.
All right. Well, I think that this has been a great one as always. Thank you, James. If anyone is not following at Gomunized, you totally should. Great account, great guy. Thank you as always.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you all our audience for listening. This has been Gladio for Europe.
No.